Hello, this is DW News, and we are streaming to you live from Berlin on YouTube and on TikTok, and as well on good old-fashioned TV. I'm Gerhard.
And I'm Beenish, Javed. Welcome.
Now, if you're just waking up or scrolling through, the world looks a tiny bit different than it did just a couple of hours ago. Iran, the US, and Israel have apparently agreed to a 2-week ceasefire. We're talking a 14-day pause on a war that felt like it was heading toward a point of no return. Friday is the day to watch now. That's when negotiations are due to kick off in Pakistan's capital, Islamabad. How did we get here? Because the vibes were pretty dark last night. President Trump went from warning that, quote, a whole civilization will die tonight, to suddenly calling an Iranian 10-point plan workable. He's already pivoting, tweeting about a new golden age for the Middle East and saying big money will be made, of course. But, and that's a big but, he's already called parts of that same plan fraudulent. So prepare for another Trump roller coaster as this develops.
And the Prime Minister of Pakistan, and you have to run my prompter, and the Prime Minister of Pakistan, the country that brokered the ceasefire, says the warring sides have agreed to an immediate ceasefire everywhere, including Lebanon. He wrote on a post on X that the move is effective immediately. But Prime Minister Netanyahu says Israel supports the pause with Iran, but the war with Hezbollah in Lebanon, not so much. He wants to continue that. We will dig into the details with expert analysts.
Yes, despite the chaos, the global reaction is basically a collective thank God. There are hopes this opens the door for stable gas prices and a prompt and safe restart of shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. No sign of that yet, since you asked, but markets are up on the news. So is this the beginning of a lasting peace or just a short breather? We'll find out with our experts. And please drop your thoughts and questions in the live chat. Are you buying this ceasefire, or is this just a PR pause?
And now, I will be looking at your questions and comments. Yes, Gerhard.
Beenish, I want to start with negotiations on the fine print of this. This is just a broad plan. We'll start in Islamabad on Friday, I believe.
Yes.
Why Islamabad? Why Pakistan?
And there are many reasons. Gerhard, for Pakistan, a lot was at stake. And not many people know, but since the start of the war, Pakistan had been aggressively, frantically making diplomatic calls to the regional leaders. Pakistan's army chief and the civilian leadership, they made visits to Saudi Arabia. They were making calls with Gulf leaders, with Iranian leadership, and also with the US. Because Pakistan, the war had come to Pakistan's doorstep. Pakistan shares a 900-kilometer-long border with Iran, and historically, Pakistan immediately feels effects of the conflict if it's in the region. And therefore, at this point, Pakistan was from the very beginning, very sure at one point that it did not want to be dragged into the conflict. There are many complexities. Pakistan has a defense pact with Saudi Arabia, a country that Iran was attacking. So there were high risks for Pakistan to be dragged into the conflict, become part of the conflict, increase hostilities with Iran. That's the kind of scenario Pakistan didn't want. So from the very beginning and to this point, we see that Pakistan was actively involved in diplomacy. And now we see that that's why probably Islamabad is now the place where finally direct talks will be held between US officials and Iranian officials.
Just briefly walk us through, how did this all unfold? Because it looked, with the deadline, Trump's deadline to expire last night, it looked quite dire.
Yes, and the last 2 days there was a lot of activity happening in the last 2 days. We know that Pakistan presented a 2-stage peace plan to Iran that Iran rejected. It was causing for an immediate ceasefire, opening of Strait of Hormuz, and then the talks. But then we saw that Donald Trump tweeted with very expletive, very vocal threats to Iran. Iran at one point pulled out of the negotiations, reportedly. But in the background, Pakistan was still actually redoubling down on its efforts, redoubling its efforts to make sure that diplomacy still works. And eventually we saw that Pakistan Prime Minister then tweeted and then said, requested Donald Trump, requested the Iranian officials for a ceasefire, for the opening of Strait of Hormuz. And what we see now is the result of those last-ditch efforts by Pakistan.
Now, That's a big win for Pakistan, is it?
It certainly is. It's not. It's a complex diplomatic feat that a country like Pakistan has been able to pull off. I remember, it's a country that just a few years ago, Pakistan was completely isolated by Washington. Nobody talked about Pakistan, but since Donald Trump came into power, Pakistan's civilian and military leadership, they extended their relations with the United States. A lot of it goes back to the intense war that Pakistan had last year with India. Pakistan was very quick to endorse Donald Trump's position that it was Donald Trump that brokered the peace between Pakistan and India. Pakistan even nominated Donald Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize. And not only that, in the region, Pakistan has very good relations with China, okay relations with, there are no hostilities with Russia. It has no major hostilities with Iran, with very good relations with Gulf countries. It does not house any US base. So it made it a neutral body,
ideal,
a neutral country,
ideal negotiator, yeah.
to become that country that could bring these two parties on the negotiating table.
I'd like to look at what Iran's state TV said. It basically, okay, I'm just learning that we do not have that soundbite. So we go to our first guest, Fawaz Gerges, Professor of Middle Eastern Politics and International Relations at the London School of Economics. Professor, we've seen incredible tension in Tehran recently. Who is actually making the final call on this ceasefire? Is it the military hawks in the IRGC or the diplomatic doves looking for a way out?
Well, good morning. I think it's, first of all, let's celebrate this brief moment of relief for everyone, for the world and for the region. I think what we have learned in the past 5 weeks or so, that the decision-making process in Iran is collective. It's coordinated by Iran's Supreme National Security Council and dominated by the Islamic Revolutionary Guards. I think what we have seen in the past few weeks is that the pendulum of power within Iran has shifted in favor of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards. Even though, for your own viewers, we need to stress that the office of the Supreme Leader, that is the new leader, Mujtaba al-Khomeini, is very decisive. But regardless of what has happened, what could happen, post-war Iran will see a closer organic link or links between the Islamic Revolutionary Guards and the office of the Supreme Leader, even though we have to wait to see when and if the dust settles on the battlefield in Iran in the next few weeks and next few months.
Yeah, coming back to that, is this 10-point plan from Iran, is it a genuine white flag, or is Tehran just trying to buy time?
I think there is ambiguity. As you know, diplomacy is about ambiguity. There is no clarity. So what you have on the table is an ambiguous process. And I think there's a great deal, many challenges before any kind of diplomatic breakthrough. But here is my overarching point. My overarching point is that President Trump blinked first. He was desperate to find an off-ramp. He was strategically in a box, entrapped. And I think what the Pakistani leadership, in particular the strong General Munir, offered President Trump is a way out. And at the end of the process here, that the United States really now finds itself much worse off than before when the war started. And regardless of what you think of Iran, Iran has shown impressive resilience and willpower and determination to really face catastrophe and not to blink first. So we have to wait and see whether this particular brief moment of relief could really basically develop or grow into a permanent, enduring ceasefire.
Well, we're going to dive into that a bit deeper a bit later. But let me ask you, where does this deal now leave the Iranian people? A few months ago, the regime killed thousands while Trump urged them to keep protesting. Does this deal effectively sell them out?
Well, I mean, this is the irony. Your question really is spot on, because theoretically, President Trump and Israeli Prime Minister intervened in order to help the Iranian people reclaim their government, capture their government. Just to remind your viewers, on day one, President Trump called on the Iranian people to come out and take ownership of their government. Look where we are today. President Trump, all he cares about, everything, is opening the Strait of Hormuz for shipping. Even though the Strait of Hormuz had been open for shipping before the war. And one of the results of the war is that Iran was able to block the Strait of Hormuz. And one of the major results of the war, and this is what we call in political science and international relations, basically the opposite result of the intended consequences, that the war itself has strengthened and emboldened the Islamic Republic domestically. So really the war has come at the expense of the Iranian people. I mean, think, you have 1,600 civilians in Iran who have been killed and more than 3,000 injured. Devastation for the civilian infrastructure, universities, factories, bridges, petrochemicals, on and on and on. So really the American-Israeli war has come at the expense of the Iranian people, and I think it will be seen in history, as a historian myself, as one of the greatest strategic miscalculation by an American president. President Trump not only has undermined his own credibility as a negotiator, he has undermined America's standing in the world, given how, I mean, the genocidal intent on the part of President Trump. Yesterday he said, an entire civilization will die in one day. That is threatening genocide and Holocaust against 93 million Iranians whom he had claimed initially to be helping.
I want to bring in a question. So the 10 points that Iran has presented, it is asking that the US and Israel will not attack Iran again. Do you think that this is something that will last? This demand of Iran?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question, because it froze for a second, my internet.
Yeah. So the 10 point that Iran has presented, it says that one of the demands is that Iran will not be attacked again by the US and Israel. Do you see that demand lasting and US and Israel accepting this demand? Because the reason Iran was not agreeing to the temporary ceasefire was because it will be a temporary ceasefire, and then after a few months or maybe a year or so, Iran will again be attacked, either by Israel or by the US.
Well, really, this is one of the most important points from Iran's point of view, because Iran did not just want a ceasefire; it wanted an enduring ceasefire. It wanted a lasting ceasefire. It wanted to make sure that neither the United States nor Israel basically attacks Iran again for the third time. Here is a point that we have learned about in the past 24 hours, is that China has played a major role in providing guarantees to Iran. So without China's support, so Pakistan's role was decisive, but the intervention of China in the last few hours made a huge difference for Iran. So we have to wait and see, because again, there is diplomatic ambiguity. And if you ask me to speculate, I would say that the odds are against a diplomatic, permanent, enduring ceasefire after 2 weeks, because there are so many challenges. We have not really talked about the enriched uranium. We have not really talked about lifting the sanctions on Iran. We have not really talked about Iran's regional allies, Hezbollah's, the Houthis, and Iraq. We have not really talked about basically who will control the Strait of Hormuz, Iran and Oman, or open again as before. So there are many more questions than answers. And we have to be patient and see what will happen in the next 2 weeks. Because remember, there is no trust whatsoever between Iran on the one hand and the United States, given what President Trump did. President Trump did not just deceive Iran. President Trump detonated the culture of diplomacy. You don't attack your interlocutor while you are negotiating with interlocutors, so we have to wait and see what will happen.
And just one more question. You mentioned that Pakistan played a decisive role. Can you explain to our viewers what role Pakistan played in all of this?
Well, first of all, I think what we need to understand is that President Trump values personalized diplomacy. For President Trump, it's really one-on-one. It's not about institutional diplomacy. I think what we have seen in the past 3 months is that President Trump has hollowed out American institutions, whether it's the State Department or the National Security Council or top generals, that he is really a one-man show. So leaders, world leaders, have really tried very hard to build personal relations. And Pakistan top General Munir, has been able to really create or develop very close relations with President Trump for a variety of reasons. And General Munir has really basically played a major role. Yesterday, he talked twice with President Trump in the past 2 hours before the ceasefire was announced. So all in all, Pakistan's role, given its great relationship with the Gulf and Iran and the United States, was really able to play a role as a bridge between the United States on the one hand and Iran, and that's the breakthrough. But we have to wait and see, because the actual talks will start on Friday in Pakistan between Iran and the United States. So we have to wait and see what will happen in the next few days.
Now, Fawaz, that's an interesting point. The negotiations between Iran and the US are starting there. Let's talk about Israel here, because apparently Israel says that the ceasefire doesn't apply to its war against Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Well, I think when the Pakistan's prime minister announced the deal, he said including Lebanon and other theaters, Iraq, Yemen, and Lebanon. So the Israelis continue to bomb Lebanon. Israel has called now on tens of thousands of Lebanese to evacuate again and again, as we talk, you and I. Israel was bombing Lebanon all night long yesterday. So we have to wait and see what happens and whether President Trump can basically order Netanyahu to stop attacks in southern Lebanon, because without the intervention of President Trump, Israeli Prime Minister will never end his war in Lebanon, as we have learned a good lesson that President Trump has the final say. So again, there is ambiguity, and there are differences, and there are major challenges, and we'll see whether President Trump will prevail on his Israeli counterpart to stop his war in southern Lebanon.
And we have a comment actually from one of our YouTube users, Mindy Morgan, and they say this is a 2-week ceasefire, nothing less, nothing more, and almost all of the things that Iran wanted have been agreed upon. Do you agree, Fawaz?
No, nothing has been agreed upon. It's really now, it's the start of a process. The state offered 25 points. It was rejected by Iran. Iran presented a 10-point. President Trump said it's we can work with the 10 points. But the 10 points is a wish list by Iran. I mean, this is an ideal type wish list. And surely the United States, if the United States accepts Iran's wish list, the United States basically accepts defeat, because that's exactly what Iran is asking the United States. So even though President Trump has blinked first, I think there's a long way to go. We have to really travel a long trail in order to reach the safe harbor of an enduring peace process.
Fawaz, what are if we're talking about this process now and these 10 points, can you already identify one of these points or two that will be an absolute no-go for the Americans?
The first point is Iran insists on lifting all sanctions and allowing Iran to use its funds, frozen funds, in the United States and elsewhere. The second point, Iran insists on reparations for the damages that the United States and Israel inflicted on Iran. Thirdly, Iran wants to make sure that it has the right for uranium enrichment, because this was a major blocking point during the negotiations. And Iran wants to have, even though it's open the Strait of Hormuz for shipping, Iran want to have a kind of a system of control. Iran and Oman will be in charge of the system of control. So again, what will happen to the 700 pounds enriched uranium in Iran? Will the United States lift all the sanctions on Iran? Will the United States accept Iran's to enrich uranium at home? Will the United States be willing to pay reparations for Iran and Israel? Because this would be acknowledging legal liability. And what will happen ultimately for the Strait of Hormuz? Will any party be in charge of the Strait of Hormuz? And we'll go back to what it was before the start of the American-Israeli war against Iran.
I think Strait of Hormuz is an interesting point because what we understand is that Iran is asking that Strait of Hormuz, the money that Iran will make from Strait of Hormuz, it will share with Oman. Do you see that arrangement practically happening? Because it will effectively give control of Strait of Hormuz to Iran.
You know, I think, again, for our viewers, this is really, you ask the maximum, right? This is what diplomacy is all about. Because you want to bargain, you want to negotiate, you want to basically position yourself. Iran, from the beginning, really, was willing to negotiate, but it was the United States and Israel who preempted the diplomatic process and attacked Iran. So we're back to the negotiating table. Let's celebrate that. Let's hope that both sides will bridge their differences and reach a peaceful settlement at the end of the two-week process, even though I'm very skeptical, unfortunately.
And if we stay with the map that we are seeing on the screen, if our producer can bring that map again, we see Iran, we see Strait of Hormuz, and we see a lot of Gulf countries. My question to you is, do you see with this ceasefire things getting any better between Iran and the Gulf countries that have come directly under Iranian fire?
You know, another great question, really. Another great question because of what we call the unintended consequences of war. Because one of the major unintended consequences of the war is basically the vulnerability of the Arab Gulf countries to Iranian attacks. That the Arab countries now, the Arab Gulf countries feel more vulnerable than before. They are deeply disappointed with what the United States and Israel did. They feel that now Iran has a stranglehold over the Strait of Hormuz. This is the first time that Iran has asserted its control over the Strait of Hormuz. And that's why, in fact, the British Prime Minister, where I am now, is visiting the Gulf today, because he wants to reassure the Arab Gulf countries that the United Kingdom will try to protect them. So I think what you're going to see in the future is that the Arab Gulf state will try to diversify their relations, will have a closer relation with Europe, Germany, Italy, United Kingdom, Ukraine, China, India, and Russia, as opposed to really putting all their eggs in one basket, the United States, because they feel very disappointed with what President Trump did. He did not inform them, he did not consult with them, he did not even defend them when Iran basically attacked their security and their economy. So one of the major consequences of what we have seen in the past few weeks is that a new security architecture will have to be created to ensure stability or rough stability in the Gulf, because the old system has been shattered to a million pieces as a result of the 5-week war by the United States and Israel and Iran.
Talking about the Gulf states, Fawaz, before we let you go, what do you think, what kind of effect in the long run will this war have on the relations between the Gulf states and Israel?
I think this is, again, another, thanks for the question, another major consequences, one of the major consequences. I think the Gulf state now will never, ever develop closer relations with Israel as a result of what has happened. If you ask me, in terms of the big strategic picture, Israel will emerge much weaker strategically as a result of this war. The survey, the opinion polls in the United States are shocking. More and more Americans now try to distance themselves from Israel. More and more American opinion makers believe that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu basically convinced Donald Trump to go to war. He basically lulled Donald Trump into a kind of a perception that this war will be clean, easy, and fast. So even on the Republican side, even within the MAGA movement, President Trump, more and more say this was not America's war, this was Israel's war. And that's why the Gulf states never joined the war, because they don't really want to have anything with Israel. So I think the so-called Abraham Accords will be, I think, much weaker as a result. And the Gulf states will try to distance themselves from Israel because of what they have seen in the past 5 weeks, and how Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu really is waging what I call a forever war, not just in Lebanon, the West Bank and Gaza and Syria, but even against Iran, even though this, and everyone knows this was really a war of choice, illegal, unlawful, unnecessary. And in fact, at the end of this war now, we're back to square one. In fact, not just square one, square zero. That the situation is much worse for the United States and the Gulf state and the world community, the global community, the world economy, than it was before the United States and Israel decided to attack Iran, 5 weeks ago.
Well, several very, very interesting points there from Fawaz Gerges, Professor of Middle Eastern Politics and International Relations at the London School of Economics in London. We'll let you go now. Thank you very much, Professor. And now we, so to speak, cross the Atlantic, if you will, to get the US side of things into view. Let's bring in the political scientist in the Department of Political and Social Science at Zeppelin University in Friedrichshafen here in Germany. And he is in his research focusing on US politics. And now, what do you, Mike Cowburn, sorry, I forgot your name, actually. Mike, what do you make of the quite drastic change in Trump's tone yesterday, going from, quote, wiping out a civilization to calling the plan a workable basis for negotiations?
Yes, I mean, thanks for having me. I think that for those of us who kind of focus on trying to kind of analyze US politics, and in particular try and analyze Trump, it's been a kind of bracing 5-week period where some of our kind of analytical strategies have sort of gone out the window. I think at this point, it doesn't really make so much sense to kind of think of Trump as a normal politician responding kind of rationally, where his approach has been, to be put it mildly, incoherent. And I think we could even potentially suggest he's showing signs that he's not all that well cognitively. And my reading of the situation here would be really very much informed by what preceded it. I think he basically felt that he was going to have a fairly easy time in this operation or war, based on what happened in Venezuela. Venezuela was obviously such a kind of quick and great success. And what Trump has ended up finding out is that he's been backed into a corner, and he's really been kind of lashing out. And we've seen that perhaps nowhere more than ever than, some of these Truth Social posts over the weekend. And so I think trying to kind of get to kind of a strategic understanding of the logic that's going through this doesn't really make sense in kind of traditional political terms. I think what we can also see here is that the Trump administration didn't really have a clear understanding about kind of Iran and kind of strategic politics in the region. And again, hasn't really known how to react to how things have played out. And so then that's what's, on a kind of personal level, kind of increased this kind of incoherence of what we might even think of as kind of lashing out by Trump. Well,
the rather erratic behavior of Donald Trump that we've getting used to. What about his administration? You just mentioned it. Is there nobody who could have foreseen this?
So I think we've learned a lot about the internal dynamics of the administration. And I think we can see here the real difference between the first Trump administration and the second Trump administration. And I think the real difference here is around kind of expertise and a willingness to kind of stand up to Trump. We don't have a deep level of expertise here. When you put people like Pete Hegseth, whose previous job, let's not forget, was as a Fox News anchor in charge of the Department of Defense or Department of War, you can kind of foresee that some of these kind of downstream effects might happen. It wasn't particularly difficult for outsiders to observe that the dynamics of Iranian politics would make this war completely different to the situation in Venezuela. And people would have pointed you straight to the Straits of Hormuz and said, this regime has the potential to kind of choke off global oil supplies and then target allies across the region. And so this lack of expertise is really kind of a key characteristic of this second administration. And the one person who seems to have expected that this would be a complete disaster was J.D. Vance. And J.D. Vance has been notable by his absence from any engagement with this issue. So he's currently campaigning in Hungary for Viktor Orban, really trying to pivot away and keep away from this issue. And I strongly suspect that's because he had a better understanding and a better idea of the kind of impact this issue and this war would end up having. What we could also see, though, is at the kind of congressional level, we still aren't seeing numbers of Republicans, under different circumstances. This could be an impeachment issue, particularly the kind of behavior and rhetoric that we've been seeing from Trump. But we're not seeing Republicans in Congress making any noises about impeachment. So we can see that Trump does still have this hold over party elites. Now, before we come to our first viewer question to you, I want to still focus on what you've just said. We've covered the administration and the lack of expertise there. We've covered the Republican Party and all the reasons they haven't intervened. But what about the military? Many people have said the worst will be prevented by reasonable people in the military that will strongly advise against that kind of war or refuse orders. So what happened there? So again, we can see it, the kind of upper echelons, the people he's surrounding himself with in these dynamics are not the same set of people issuing these kind of urging caution that we saw in the first administration. And so we're really not seeing that kind of pushback. There's also kind of institutional reasons for that. The military historically is not wanting to go against orders and this kind of thing. But we have seen some generals step down or be moved aside. So I'm not an expert in kind of intra-military dynamics. But my hunch is that wasn't hugely surprising from a kind of political standpoint. From an institutional standpoint, we wouldn't expect the military to kind of be a bulwark in this scenario, though, of course, it can offer advice. My expectation and kind of reading of the situation is at this point, Trump is just not in a kind of mental state to be receptive to dissenting voices. And so these people are probably being kept at arm's length. Okay. We come to our first viewer question.
It's not a question, it's a comment by one of our users on TikTok. Do not be afraid. So that's his name on TikTok. And he says that Trump will not be impeached and that Democrats may lose hugely in the midterms. So if you want to say something on that.
So, I mean, I agree with the first part of the statement that I don't think Trump will be impeached. But I strongly disagree with the second part. We know that historically, even this war aside, historically incumbent presidents lose very badly, tends to be in the midterms. And so what we're seeing right now among Republicans, even among Republicans, is a kind of growing discord with Trump. I don't think that we can see much in what's been happening in the last few months that will appeal to kind of swing voters or centrist voters who are primarily going to be concerned about the economic fallout from this war. But what we're also seeing, particularly around the kind of MAGA online right, is that we're also seeing kind of pushback against some of these narratives. So if we think about figures like Tucker Carlson or Candace Owens, or the kind of the anti-Semitic groups like Nick Fuentes, they're pushing back very strongly on this, and they've been an important part of the MAGA online right. And the fact that Trump is losing these groups might further be disadvantageous to them in the midterms. These groups aren't numerically massive, but they are important for the kind of campaign dynamics, and also given the kind of internal power that Trump leveraged from these groups previously within the Republican Party. Republicans in Congress might, for example, feel less threat to their personal safety from disagreeing with Trump, given that if some of these groups kind of fragment off. But I think more generally, I think the bigger dynamics for the midterms will be the economic consequences of this war. And I think those are very difficult for Republicans or for Trump to kind of spin as this being a win for America. There's practically nothing in these kind of agreement points that the Trump administration would have agreed to 6 weeks ago. This is a very different kind of negotiating position that they're finding themselves in, and has done significant damage to the reputation of Trump, both at home and abroad.
But Mike, my question is that despite the, like our earlier guest said, the off-ramp that the US has now gotten with this temporary truce, will it not work politically well for Donald Trump, even if there is eventually a permanent ceasefire and end of war with Iran?
So let's talk about that kind of positive outcome, if that is something that's achievable. Again, like your previous guest, I have my doubts that is likely to hold. But even in a scenario where it did, this is still not something that's going to be felt as a win for Trump or as a win for America back home. On the kind of online right side of things, you're going to get pushback on the grounds that this isn't what MAGA was about. MAGA was supposed to be about not getting involved in these forever wars abroad and prioritizing the rights and needs of American citizens, in particular white American citizens, back home. And so for that group, it will not feel this as a win, as a victory. And then for the rest of the voters, I think what will be the most concern will be the economic downstream consequences of it. And so we might see a situation where the ceasefire, I mean, we've already seen this morning that the stock market rebounding, and the economic situation will improve from where it is today in that scenario, but it will not improve relative to if these attacks on Iran had never happened. There is no kind of economic upside to this that has not been self-inflicted. The position that the US finds itself in, and again, we're not clear about what the exact situation is going to be around the Straits of Hormuz, but there's talk of potentially a toll of $2 billion per oil tanker going through the strait, which will go in payments to Iran and Oman. Well, that's not a scenario that is very easy for Trump to sell. And what this also does is it gives the Democratic Party lots of opportunities to attack Trump on his word, not least given these kind of lashing out and rash kind of communication style that he's been going through in the last few weeks. These are attack points that the Democratic Party could, in theory, quite basically leverage, that don't just appeal to kind of left of center or liberal leaning voters. These are things you can communicate to voters across the entire political spectrum.
Mike, before I let you go, I'm going to ask you the same question I asked our previous guest. Given the fact that there are so many difficult points in this first draft of a 10-point plan. Do you expect that this plan will come to fruition and will lead to a proper negotiated peace plan anytime soon?
So I share the skepticism of Fawaz before me in that initially we've seen this morning there's not even agreement about exactly what is included and excluded from this 2-week ceasefire. So Pakistan's president came out this morning and said that Israel's invasion of southern Lebanon is included, whereas Israel is saying, no, this is not included. This is a separate war against Hezbollah. Hezbollah have said that they will respect the ceasefire. But even this morning, we've also seen some Iranian attacks on Gulf states, including Bahrain. So to me, the initial hurdle, even within that 2-week period, before we get to the really big issues, is can we get to a point where all sides are agreeing what is included in the ceasefire? Because right now, where we're sitting, that is not the scenario. We're still seeing Israel attacking Lebanon and Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. So if we can't even get to a point where we agree what the scope conditions of the ceasefire are, then it seems very difficult to even get to the negotiating table for that. I see that Keir Starmer is heading to the Middle East today. I think that external pressure, particularly from the European Union states and Great Britain, will be really important here. I think there's been a big loss of face of kind of American power across the region. And so can other groups intervene? And I do worry at this initial stage that we haven't even got to a place where all the different groups are agreeing what is included in the ceasefire.
So a lot of skepticism there from both our experts today. Thank you very much, Mike Cowburn, a political scientist.
Thank you for having me.
At the Zeppelin University in Friedrichshafen. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us. And I think that's it for today from Beenish and me. Before we go, here's a quick recap of the main developments. Iran, the US and Israel have agreed a 2-week ceasefire after Donald Trump threatened to destroy Iran's civilization. Israel says the deal does not apply to Lebanon, where Israel has been launching strikes against its arch-rival in the region, the Iran-backed Hezbollah militia. Iran is demanding guarantees against being attacked again in the future. And in return, Iran would reopen the Strait of Hormuz, where much of the world's oil supply has been bottlenecked for a month. And in response to the news, stock markets in Europe and Asia are soaring while the oil price has dropped. And that's it from me and Beenish. Thank you very much.
And goodbye.
Goodbye.